When looking into the history of design, there tends to be a common theme of what is considered to be notable. So much of what is considered to be important work is usually done by men, and the majority of work done by anyone outside that descriptor is typically connected to a man, either being a daughter, a wife, or sister of a more notable designer. This situation has led to the erasure of dozens of women in design, especially queer women, as queer women tend to not have their lives circle men as much, leading to less connections to men. No notable men in their lives leads to less recognition they receive. This leads to a more prominent erasure of queer women in not just design history, but also history as a whole. As tragic as this is, what can we do to fix it? While unfortunately we can't time travel and go back in time and write down the history of these designers, we can look into the few that do have their stories written down and publicize their work, as well as supporting queer designers in the field now. History is still ongoing, and we can share work and design practice spaces done by queer designers today. When we look at Mae Morris in the context of queer design history, she has recently begun to grow in popularity in more recent years, but yet a lot of sources tend to gloss over her queer identity in favor of pointing out the men in her life. Despite her partner, Mary Lobb, being the person she spent the last 22 years of her life with, and then before she passed away, left the majority of her possessions, including Kelmscott Manor. Some background information on Mae Morris. She was born March 25th in 1862. In England, her parents were William and Jane Morris. Both of her parents were super involved with the arts and craft movement, leading Mae down the same path. Mae attended both National Art Training School and the Royal College of Art, and soon after her schooling in the 1880s, she worked for her father's company, Morris & Company. She was the director of the embroidery department, and she published her own book called Decorative Needlework in 1893. When her father passed away in 1896, Mae moved up in the company, but never ran or owned the company herself. In 1907, Mae Morris co-founded the Women's Guild of Art with Mary Elizabeth Turner in response to not being permitted to join the Art Workers Guild. Their hope was that their guild would help women working in the art fields connect in the same way men were able to connect through the original guild. Alongside all of Mae Morris's contributions to the art community, she also had multiple romantic relationships. Her most notable relationship, according to Wikipedia, was her brief marriage to Henry Halliday Spalding. The two got married in 1890 and then divorced 8 years later in 1898. Morris then had a relationship that is always described as casual, on and off, with George Bernard Shaw. The relationship had a vague, estimated 15-year window and never really amounted to much. And then there was Mary Frances Vivian Lobb. In 1923, Morris permanently moved to Kelmscott Manor, which was left to her by her mother when she passed away in 1914. Mary Lobb had been working for the local land army near Kelmscott Manor in 1917 and became the gardener at the manor around this time. This is where Morris and Lobb met. During the two's companionship, they traveled together and shared a bed, where they kept a shotgun next to them because of less than friendly locals with strong opinions about their relationship. Mae passed away in 1938 at age 76 due to illness. She left Kelmscott Manor to Lobb, with the stipulation that the manor would be used by Oxford University to later be used as a historical site dedicated to her father and his work. Mary Lobb died 5 months later in 1939. Sources are a bit unclear as to whether or not she took her own life. While looking back at Mae Morris's life and her relationships with the people around her, it feels almost obvious that her and Mary Lobb lived a caring and sweet queer life together once they met. The two faced adversity about their closeness, so why is it that their queerness is always left out of the historical narrative? A blog post from 2014 written by Sean Cullen, titled A Letter to Kelmscott Manor, describes how the manor's historical site discredits Mary Lobb entirely, describing her as nothing more than a strange masculine woman who lived at the manor. The descriptor of Mary Lobb was written by none other than George Bernard Shaw, the man that Mae Morris had a casual relationship prior to the relationship with Mary Lobb. In this blog post, Curran urged the staff of Kelmscott Manor to include more information about Mary Lobb and her relationship to Mae Morris, and described how the staff members of the manor seemingly did not find an issue with how Mary Lobb was portrayed, or how her closeness to Mae Morris was completely left out. The fact that we have so much recorded about Mae Morris's life is definitely due to the fact that her father was William Morris and was such a notable figure in the art and design history. However, blurring the narrative when it comes to Mae Morris's personal life and her work is another example about how the history revolved around men. Pieces that were accredited to William Morris, created by Mae, are just now finally being credited to Mae rather than her father. And from what I have read online, a lot of people just didn't know that Mae Morris worked with her father and had assumed that design work done by Morris & Company could be attributed to William Morris's work. And while we are now seeing her receive her credit is a very important step for women in design, the skipping over her queerness is sickening. Mae Morris is a queer woman, a part of design history, and as amazing as it is to tell her story now, there's also a point for us to go look at other women in design history who are not related to such notable figures or have the money to preserve their families' legacies. These stories are likely lost to time. We need to cherish the stories that we are able to find and share them. There is queer history in every history, and there's women's history in every history. The history of art and design is no different. We can see how women with less notable family history are treated in history by looking at Mary Lobb. While Mae Morris is getting more recognition, Mary Lobb is often sidelined for the sake of pushing Mae Morris forward, erasing the importance of their relationship in favor of making Mae Morris more palatable to the general public. Accounts of their relationship have been reduced to a close friendship, a one-sided romance, or portrayed as comically in historical sources such as biographer Fiona McCarthy's William Morris, A Life for Our Time, which describes them as two lesbian ladies of Llangollen. This is a monumental loss. Misogyny and societal hatred for women made it acceptable to blur the truth in favor of idolizing men. Downplaying queer women's relationships to appear as nothing more than a close friendship is unfair to queer women who are brave enough to live their lives, especially in a world that frowned upon their identities. Mae Morris's financial status and familial background is what allowed her story to be told. Women should not have to be born into the right family in order for their contributions to be recognized. Women should not have to marry and cater to men in order to have their contributions be recognized. All that to say is that the stories of queer women are just as important as anyone else's stories, and queer erasure is something ridiculous that should be fought against and dismantled. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. I recommend looking into Mae Morris yourself. I think it's a really fascinating story.